Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to take you through a real-time demo of 3 watercolor portrait paintings. By the time this video comes out, season 8 of Portrait Artist of the Year will already be showing on Sky and Now TV. However, at the time of recording, the trailer for this new series had just been released, and I saw the trailer on the Cass Art YouTube channel. I'll put a link in the description below if you want to check out the trailer. And I was inspired to kind of warm up for my return to portrait painting by using watercolor and trying out 3 different styles for 3 different sitters. So here's the first screenshot, or sorry, bottom right of the screen. As you can see, got a gentleman sat in a chair, legs crossed, hands intertwined, and a smile on his face. So I'm starting out with some A2 watercolor paper. This is the rough texture, not the smooth texture. I've got a round mop brush, and I'm just using some Prussian blue watercolor that I had left over on my palette from a previous painting. So the great thing about drawing with watercolor and the brush is that, you know, in general, no matter how precise you want to be, the brush and the watercolor often have different ideas. So it's a really great way to just loosen up, have some fun, not be too fussy, and just kind of focus on doing what you can and then dealing with what actually happens with each brush stroke. So you can see here, I've already outlined the head, the shoulders, some elements of the collar of both the shirt and the zip-up top he's wearing. And it's a really great way to do gestural figure studies where you're trying to capture the energy and the sense of movement within somebody, even if they're sitting still. So I really love the variety of mark making you can get with a brush of this type. And I love just how lively it feels when you put the tip of the brush onto the paper compared to using something like a Sharpie pen, for example. So the idea here is to get the figure established on the paper as quickly as possible. And then what I'll do in a moment is make corrections if I see fit. So there are lots of details we could choose to focus on. You know, we've got the zip, we've got the buttons, we've got the fingers and how they're interlaced. But for the most part, I'm ignoring all of that and trying to look at the big shapes. So, for example, if you look at the hands, I haven't even drawn 2 separate hands. I've just drawn a shape, which is approximately the shape of the 2 hands combined in silhouette. And then when we come to the chair, when somebody's sitting on a chair or interacting with something, perhaps leaning on a wall, or they've got their hand resting on a table, something like that, then it's really important to look at the different contact points and see how the figure occupies the space relative to that inanimate object. So you have to be careful that the structure of the chair is believable, but that everything kind of lines up. So the top of each arm of the chair lines up with the appropriate parts of the body, both in terms of the horizontal level and the vertical position as well. So the outline work is done. Same brush, but now coming in with some yellow ochre to apply some loose washes to areas of skin that are showing. Now, in general, when I do portrait paintings, which are more considered and, you know, take a bit longer, you know, I might take 2 or 3 hours to do a full portrait painting normally, possibly longer if it was the full figure, then my go-to medium is interactive acrylic paint, and that's really expressive, and it is also very quick to use. You know, you can get great results in a very quick time compared to other media, or at least that's my experience. However, watercolor is another level of speed, so that's another reason it's great for doing warm-up studies. You can just cover so much area and get effects so quickly as you use wet and wet, as I'm doing here. So the yellow ochre is down. Now I'm coming in with some burnt sienna on top of the still wet yellow ochre. And of course, doing that, you sacrifice some control, but you get, you know, wonderful intermixing effects, which you just can't paint deliberately. You just have to let the watercolor do its own thing. So what I've done on the face there is very, very approximately picked out some areas of shadow, and then obviously the watercolor is doing its own thing. Now I'm coming into the hair, and as I do this, I'm making some corrections to the size of the head. So I felt the head was a little too small compared to the size of the body, so I'm just lengthening that by increasing the height of the top of the head. And when you're working with the paper near vertical, as I am at the moment, then that can lead to trickles and runs in the paint, which work their way down the page very, very quickly. So you have to be aware of that. You don't want to be too concerned about it, but if you do want to remove them, you've got to act very quickly, because they will sometimes streak all the way down your painting. But of course, that's also an advantage as well, because when you get a little bead of watercolor, which is kind of pooled on the paper, you can tap into that and allow the paint to work its way down. But of course, if you feel that that steep near vertical angle is making things just too erratic for you, then you can always tip the easel back, or indeed, put the paper down just on a flat surface. So the angle at which we work with watercolor is much more important in general than it is with acrylic or oil. So a bit of raw umber now. I'm putting that in for the cardigan, or zip up top, whatever you want to call it. And really just trying to establish a sense of tone and colour, again, for the whole painting quickly. So these are just going to be quick studies. I'm going to do different styles for each sitter and just really have some fun, be expressive. And sometimes I find these quick experiments often have more life and energy than my more considered works. And that's just kind of the nature of the beast, really, because the more refined you make something, the more layers of paint you have, and you do lose a little bit of that spontaneity sometimes, I think. So you can see I'm not being concerned about matching colour exactly, far from it. I'm just picking out something from the palette, which is a reasonable approximation. So this is a bit of cobalt blue I've just added for the shirt. And then a bit of Payne's grey for the chair. And I'm allowing some dry brush to happen as well for the chair. Just bang on the colour, really. Get it covered and then see where you are. So let's let that first one dry. Here's the second sitter. I loved this little moment in time that was captured in the trailer, and I freeze framed the video there, took a screenshot. And I like painting people in kind of fleeting poses. I think that's great fun. So I'm taking a different approach now. I've switched to a smaller round brush, coming in again with the Prussian blue, but I'm starting with the eye this time. And then, having used that as a bit of a reference, I can then measure relative to the size of the eye where the eyebrow is, as I've just drawn. And then relative to that same eye again, look to see where the other eye or brow is. And when I'm drawing in this way, what I try to do with the brush is look carefully at my reference and think, okay, where is the single line that I need to draw? And then think about it again, and then having made the decision, I try to move the brush fairly quickly and confidently. Now, that doesn't always work, because sometimes I've made a mistake, or sometimes the brush did something that I didn't expect. But that's okay, then I'll go back in and correct it. So if you look at the first eye I just drew, and the first eyebrow in particular, I've got at least 2 or 3 lines there for some of the, what should be single lines perhaps. But that's kind of part of the energy the drawing takes on. The evidence of the history of the marks you've made helps bring the drawing to life a bit, and providing you're not too wayward with your marks, on the whole, the average of those 2 or 3 marks will kind of get you there if you're observing carefully and you're being careful with your mark making. And it also lends a sense of life and movement to the drawing as well. And the other thing I'm trying to do here is put down the minimum number of lines, because that minimizes the chance of a mistake, and it also allows the viewer to kind of read in a bit more to the image. Whereas if you describe every single little feature in full, then there isn't really that much for the viewer to interact with, I feel. So for example, the eyes I've only put in the upper lids. You can see with the mouth I haven't drawn the teeth or the tongue. I've done the outside of the mouth, the outline of the mouth, the line of the teeth, the line of the tongue, and then filled in the shadow gap, and that's it. And similarly, again, I'm just picking out, the bits of the outline of the face that I feel are absolutely necessary. Excuse me. Picking out the outlines of the parts of the face that I feel are absolutely necessary. Now, when it comes to the hands, again, I'm just looking at the fingertips initially. Which bits do I need to describe? Capturing the outline of that hand, and then the shape of the heel of the hand. And then there's a line which goes along the outer edge of the hand as well, which I just put in along with the cuff. So you can see that I'm taking a little while to decide where to paint, but when I paint, I move quite quickly. And in general, if you do that, even if things go wrong, so for example, that button I just drew, that second button's too big compared to the other three, but I don't mind that. And because I've drawn them quickly, there's a certain confidence to the line work, which will, generally speaking, read better than if you kind of just delicately put in a button with the brush and take 20 seconds to do a single circle. So when it comes to drawing the other hand, I'm marking the positions of the fingertips here. And then this lady is wearing a couple of rings, and rings are always handy to very quickly describe a cylindrical surface or near cylindrical surface. Similar treatment with the bulk of the hand compared to the other one, just popping in some quick lines to try and capture the general direction of the silhouette. Fast marks again for the other cuff of the jacket. And once again, some quick buttons with little regard for exact spacing or size. Quick line for the top of the t-shirt and a bit of shadow under the chin as well. And then really at this stage, I'm sort of thinking, well, how much more do I need to do to describe her body? And at the moment, the answer is not very much. So now I've switched to an oval round, and these are great brushes. You can see they come to a point, but if you kind of scumble them across the paper like I'm doing now, because the bristles are of different lengths, they're really fantastic for creating random textures. So if you want to do a quick tree or a bush in watercolor, or somebody's curly hair like we've got going on here, rather than trying to depict every single curl, you can combine sweeping linear brush strokes like I'm putting down now with scumbling round, swirly, tangled mark making. So it's a really fun and really effective, efficient way to capture a mass of tangles quickly. So you can see in a few seconds there, I've created a reasonable mass of hair. So just going a little bit darker now. I think I had a bit of neutral tint left on the palette. And the trick here is not to think too much about it in general, but I find you have to be kind of a little bit wary of the edge. So you want the silhouette to kind of capture the curls of the hair. And then what happens within the hair isn't quite as critical. So a couple of lines to define the upper arm. And then this is the third sitter. So I've still got that first painting to finish, but this is the third sitter. So for this one, different approach again. Coming in with a flat brush this time, starting with yellow ochre. And for this one, I thought I would minimize the number of lines that I draw, at least at the early stages. So I'm just trying to put down shapes which correspond to the face. So you can see I've I've blocked in without any line work at all the beginnings of the forehead, right hand side of the face, the right ear. I've put in a bit of a shadow for the left eye, just a little line there to mark where the left side of the neck and the left ear are. Then we've got this hand on the face. So this is why this particular still from the trailer caught my attention. It was because this chap was resting his head on his hand. So he has, I think, two fingers resting along his left cheek, and then the other two fingers, it might only be one finger actually, I just need to look more closely at the reference. Yeah, sorry, just one finger along his face, and then the other three are obviously curled up. So I've put in just a little bit of information there before I have to get too precise. And now I'm coming in with a bit of burnt sienna to add a little bit of shadow on top of that pale mid-tone I put down originally. So, when I'm painting quickly in this way, the likeness isn't always going to be as good as I can achieve if I spend, 3 hours or 2 hours on a portrait. But what I'm hoping to do here is just, get the old portrait muscles working and have some fun and hopefully capture something of the sitter and at the very least a realistic human being. And, drawing people in general, if I'm sort of outside at the beach or something and there's somebody sitting on a sea wall or in a deck chair, or there's a family playing cricket or something like that, my eye will quite often be drawn to depict the people within the scene, or even just the people themselves. I really quite like capturing or trying to capture the human figure, how the weight is distributed, and just sort of a moment in a person's life in just a few seconds or a few minutes. And I've actually got a few watercolor paintings from the summer which capture those kinds of moments. So I think I actually did paint a family playing cricket, a woman sat on the sea wall, a couple flying a kite on the beach. What else did I do? There might be a couple of others as well, but they will show up on the channel at some point. So while I was chatting away there, just grabbed some blue and popping in the darker areas of the shirt. So shadow to the left of the neck on the back of the collar, shadow to the right of the head on that shoulder, shadow under the arm, and then a few marks and lines to begin to capture some of the creases and things. I can't remember what I might have mixed up a bit of a purple actually for that shadow. It might have been ultramarine blue with a little bit of alizarin. And now I'm coming back in with some pure ultramarine blue to capture and block in the rest of the shirt. Now, probably the main mistake I've made in this painting so far, or perhaps two mistakes, are the head isn't perhaps wide enough and at quite the right angle, and then the line I've put in for where the sleeve stops and that arm begins is at entirely the wrong angle. I mean, I think it kind of works for the painting. It's okay, both the head and the angle of the sleeve, but in terms of getting things exactly as they are in the reference, those two things definitely aren't correct. But as an expressive piece of work so far, reasonably content. So that shoulder on our left, that comes up quite high. So I'm putting that in now. And again, working fairly quickly, so you keep the energy in the painting and not getting too fussy with details. But even with this quick way of working, I am keeping in mind, for the most part, the direction of the contours of the surface of the thing I'm painting. So I need to let that one dry. So that's why I've switched back to this first painting, which is now dry. And I'm coming in with a blue ballpoint pen to just refine some of the lines I've got here, or some of the edges that have been created with the watercolor washes. And this is another combo that I love using, a blue ballpoint pen on top of watercolor. I really just like the way those two media work together. So what I'm doing here is I draw in some line work is I'm still trying to be fairly minimal with the lines I put down. I'm adding little bits of texture here and there where I feel it's appropriate. I'm definitely correcting where I feel it's necessary, and looking, I'm not, as you've probably gathered, I'm not commentating on this video live, but so it's kind of interesting from my point of view. I find if I'm chatting as I paint on those sort of real-time demo videos where it's almost like, I'm doing a live demo. That's interesting because I have to stay in the moment, all the time, to kind of describe what I'm doing and stay focused on what I'm painting. Whereas with this type of video, I just paint and I don't have to worry about commentating. And then I get to watch the footage back as I'm discussing what I'm doing. And I find it a lot easier to spot my mistakes in this case. So, for example, I think I've made the hair on the right hand side of the above the right hand side of the forehead. That's a bit too thick, I think, and the shape of the forehead up the top there is incorrect as well. But while I was chatting away there, you can see I've popped in an eyebrow, an indication of an eye, the line under the cheek, and some of the nose. So looking at the corners of the eyes, the shapes of the eyebrows, and the corners of the mouth in particular, all of those things are very important to capture the expression of the sitter. So in this particular case, this is where photography is obviously a massive advantage, because it would be rare to capture a sitter who's smiling if you're working from life. It is something I've done, but it requires a few special techniques basically, so that the person doesn't end up with this sort of just stilted, rather fake smile. If you make the sitter stay still for 2 hours in a fixed grin, it's going to start to look pretty strained fairly quickly. So when it comes to the smile, I'm really, as I said, I'm looking at the corners of the mouth, the shapes of the lips. So just as a simple mouth shape, and then putting in just a little bit of shadow here and there underneath the top teeth, but not going into too much detail again at this stage. So I can continue to work my way around the head. I've just refined the jawline and some of the hairline, now working on the shape of the ear. So it's quite a nice way to work, I think, this combination, because as mentioned earlier, with the way I painted this particular subject with the blocking in with the watercolor kind of does its own thing to a certain extent, both with the brushwork lines at the beginning and also with the washes, because I had the paper very steep and I used fairly dilute washes. And then you can come in and refine things with the biro, and then if necessary you can go back on top of that with the watercolor, and then when that's dry do a bit more biro, and so on and so on. So it's a lovely layered approach. And of course, most people have got a ballpoint pen somewhere in their uh, domain in their house or their office or wherever they happen to be. So I like using everyday materials like Sharpie markers and ballpoint pens once in a while. And then even with the watercolor kit I'm using, as you saw earlier in the video, I'm just using a little handheld tin, and it's so compact and lightweight. It really makes doing plein air work so much fun, because you don't have to set up. You just pop the lid open, and if you've got some water and paper and a brush, you're good to go. So while I was chatting away there, a few more details on the lines of the collar of the shirt. and then back in to check out the shoulders. So you can see the shoulder on our right, my brushwork has made that shoulder too broad, and on the left, my brushwork has made that shoulder too low. So again, I'm making little corrections here and there, but these are meant to be quick warm-up watercolor portrait studies. So I'm not going to labor too heavily on getting things perfectly exact. But again, we can make corrections as we go around. So you can see the right-hand side of the collar of the zipped top, the line I had with the brushwork, nice and expressive as it was far too far over to the right. So if I was just doing a figure study, I might well leave all the brush lines pretty much as they are because it's free and it's expressive and gestural and it's convincing enough. But if we're trying to capture the individual person, then corrections are necessary. And then if I was doing a full portrait, I would not only make these second corrections, but I would probably make third and fourth and fifth and however many corrections are needed until I was happy with the painting as a whole. And then that also leads us to the question of when should we stop with a particular painting? So once you feel pretty content with it, even if you're not sure about a couple of areas, I find it's often best to stop rather than risk messing things up. And if you are tempted to continue, if you can discipline yourself, and I fully admit to not being able to do so at times, but it's certainly best to put the painting away for a bit, maybe a week or two, or sometimes even longer, and then just look at it with completely fresh eyes. So I've resisted the urge at the moment to further refine the hands or do too much on the chair. I'm just coming back in with some darker colour now, blue with a little bit of brown mixed in, if memory serves me correctly, to put in some of these deeper shadows. There might be a bit of red in there as well. So you can see there I just put a little dot of paint over the iris of the right-hand eye, which I'd already shaded in somewhat with the biro, darkening the hair. So, very much, especially if you're working quickly, tone should be the priority over color, because it's the balance of light, medium, and dark tones which are going to create a sense of three dimensions and capture the personality of the sitter far more than color on its own ever will. And so if you're trying to work quickly and just capture an effect, then really if you think of just dark and light as the absolute minimum, that'll get you there. But if you want to do something a little more modeled, if you think of dark, light, middle tone, just those three things, if you can get those three things sorted out pretty well, then the rest is just fine tuning. Where are the few brightest highlights? Where are the few deepest shadows? Are there any areas which transition from mid-tone to shadow or mid-tone to highlight, where you need to blend things a little more and have a bit of a graduated boundary? But if you break it down, as a general rule, if you break it down into, as I say, dark, middle tone and light, then you're not going to go too far wrong. And because watercolor is transparent and because I've got those base colors down already, I can, if I want to, use the same shadow color or a similar shadow color on the shirt compared to the face and the hair. So the same color everywhere. When it dries, especially because I'm putting down a transparent layer, the underlying colors will show through. So using the same shadow color more or less everywhere will bring a sense of coherence to the finished painting, but we will get enough variation in color because of the transparency that we'll still see things as a distinct zip up top, shirt, skin, hair, and so on. I've added a little bit of neutral tint to the mixture now for some deeper shadows. And if you're not familiar with neutral tint, I don't know if all the brands of watercolor do it, but Winsor & Newton, they certainly do a tube which is just labeled neutral tint. And it's really good, as the name implies. It's a true neutral. So it's a great way of just darkening any color without shifting the color towards the red or the blue. And it can really add quite a bit of punch to your watercolors, because it's a nice way to get a deep shadow. And if you look at the reference photo, the top is obviously in reality much darker than I've got it. But within that dark color, there are some very deep shadows on the arm on our right, which I've included, and underneath the collar on the shoulder on our right and chest on our right as well. And then, of course, there's that kind of buckle or fold in the top going across the top of the belly as well. Now for the background, I'm coming in with an orangey red here, not trying to copy the background color at all, but I'm doing this for two reasons. One is just to make the fairly pale browns that I've got throughout the figure kind of stand out a little bit more from the background. And also it's going to allow me to adjust the silhouette, in particular the outline of the head, because I've got a little bit too much just a little bit too much of the top of the head going on, basically, in terms of the hairdo. One of the things I try to avoid when I can is I try to avoid painting a halo of color around a figure as the background. So even if there are parts of the background where the brush stroke runs parallel to the edge of the figure, I'll always try to include at least some parts where the brush stroke is coming off at an angle, or coming out radially from a curve, as I've just done there on the head. Now, in terms of color choice of the background, it's perhaps conventional to make the subject of a painting based on, or colored based on, primaries and secondaries. This is obviously a sweeping statement. Brighter, bolder colors, and then the background, because in general we're often trying to create a sense of depth, but in general the background might be more typically neutral colors, tertiary colors, paler colors, softer edges. But there's no reason we can't play around with that convention and flip things. So for the most part, this figure is painted in what I would consider to be tertiary colors. So there's lots of browns and grays, yellow ochres there. Obviously there is some blue in the shirt, but the background I'm using here is very much, if not primary, it's at least secondary, really. If it is anything other than red, it's orangey red. So, but what I am doing here is just being aware of the tone I'm putting down. So I've made it darker on the left-hand side of the figure and then making it paler as I go to the right. And that's to enhance the sense of light coming from the left, which, isn't all that great at the moment. So with that in mind, what I've done is I've taken a little round brush now and mixed in some titanium white interactive acrylic with some of the watercolor I've already got on my palette. And I'm just using that to add a few highlights on the left-hand side of the face. So in particular, there's a highlight on the left-hand side of the forehead, which I've already added, the left-hand side of the nose, and the top of the left cheek, or our left cheek. The cheek on our left, I should say. And then obviously the teeth as well are slightly lighter than I had them. And again, obviously the whole point of this video is we're doing 3 quick portrait experiments. So I'm not going to labor too long on trying to get every little detail correct. The point is to have some fun and experiment with different styles and, explore the options available with watercolor. So adding a touch of acrylic to the watercolor you've got available, it's a nice way to add a few highlights here and there. The interactive acrylics in particular I find mix very well with watercolors. And of course, traditional watercolor, what you're meant to do is leave areas of the paper completely uncoated, and that's your white highlight. But for what I'm doing here, I don't worry about that sort of thing too much. And in general, I don't worry about that sort of thing too much. If I can make it work that way, then I'm very happy to go that route. But if I've put a lot of work into a painting, or even just spent a few minutes on it, and I kind of feel, I quite like what I've got here, I'm not going to consider a painting ruined just because I have to add a bit of white on top or a bit of acrylic on top. So back in with the ballpoint pen now, and I mentioned earlier I'm using blue. I tend to avoid using black ballpoint pen just because I feel the line is a little harsh. That said, recently I have been using some water-resistant ink pens which are black, and I do like the look of, that those give against the watercolor. I think that works quite well, but for some reason, in general, with ballpoint pen, I prefer using the blue compared to the black ink. And what I'm doing here is I'm just tidying up and fine-tuning the shapes of the eyebrows, the shapes of the eyes, putting in a few little fine details here and there. Just trying to improve the likeness and capture a little bit more of the expression of the sitter. What I'm resisting here always is the temptation to do too much line work or to completely outline something. So for example, if I was going to completely outline the nose with biro, I would try to be careful to vary the quality of the line as we work our way around the nose, so that it doesn't just look like the line you would get in a comic book drawing or a superhero drawing. A little bit of shadow under the teeth, so I'm treating the teeth very much as a whole. I'm not picking out individual teeth here. Further finishing touches, just gradually working our way around the face. Back to sitter 3. So this one's now dry. So now I can come in with a little bit of raw umber or burnt umber, still with the flat brush, and I can start to add just a little bit of line work and a little bit of darker shadow. So for the first one, we obviously did brush line work, some washes of color, went back in once that was dry and refined things, and then at a couple of different stages also added some line work and cross hatching and a bit of shading with the ballpoint pen. For Portrait 2, that was just a pure brush drawing. But then for this third version, if you remember, I put down just the shapes. There was very little drawing as such. I was just blocking in shapes of tone and color. And what I'm doing now, as you can see, is I'm starting to add just a little bit more definition, but still with the flat brush. So I used a round brush for the most part, of one type or another for the first one, round brush for the second one, but this one's a flat brush painting. So even when I'm drawing in more detail here, I'm trying to draw in shapes where I can. So for example, the eyebrows, difficult to do much with that other than a line, although even there we can think about the shape of each section of the line used for the eyebrows. But then when it comes to the shadow to the right of the nose, under the nose, slightly to the left of the nose, and now on the right cheek where the finger is and the hand are kind of interacting with the face, rather than think of those boundaries as lines, we can think of all of those things as different shapes of shadow. So, sometimes it will be a line, but, if you can make it a shape as opposed to just a line from A to B, it generally makes for a more interesting painting and a more impactful painting, I would say. So again, not going for an exact likeness here, not worrying that the angle that I've got the head is somewhat incorrect. Just using the reference as a guide to get an approximation of lighting and proportion, and then just seeing what we end up with in a relatively short amount of time. Now, I did feel the need there to outline that left ear a little bit, because otherwise it would have just disappeared completely into the background and looked as if it was missing. A slightly warmer red now, a bit of brown rather, slightly warmer brown, a little bit of burnt sienna added to the mix. Now, when it comes to these fingers, rather than try to paint each individual finger that's curled round, simply I'm looking at it as a block of fingers all sort of stuck together. So just looking at that big shape, always going for the biggest shapes where possible with this type of painting. Now, sorry about the brush disappearing off screen there momentarily. I fixed that in just a few seconds, but you'll be able to see what I did in just a tick. But in the meantime, just adding some cast shadows there to the top of the shoulder, to the right of the hand, a couple of lines to, show a couple of creases in the shirt. And all I was doing when I did that brush stroke off camera was putting in a bit of cast shadow underneath the forearm there. So, and a little bit of extra shadow on the crease in the shirt over the belly. And again, using this kind of glazing multi-layer technique to just darken further some of the dark shadows I'd put in with the bluey purple earlier on. So once watercolor's dry, unless you really scrub at it, then it's you can generally paint over it without too much worry, especially if you're gentle. So buttons and the seams in the fabric of or garment, either side of a row of buttons are good ways to create little contours and show what's going on as the clothes fall across the body. Decided to stick with the wrong angle there on the cuff of the shirt. A few lines, and then at this stage I'm starting to think, do I need to do too much more? Because I really like the freshness of this one. I think perhaps this is my favourite of the three. But just going back in with the corner of the brush. So this kind of work where you stick with just one pretty decent sized brush compared to the size of the painting, that's a good exercise, because it really makes you consider the angle at which you're going to put the brush down in order to obtain the shape of the mark that you get. And then, as mentioned before, with watercolor, it tends to do its own thing a little bit anyway. These brushes are reasonably soft as well, so that makes things a little less precise perhaps. So it's also a great exercise in, once you've thought about what you want to get and how you're going to get it, then having to deal with not getting quite what you want and having to, resolve that little problem. So there's painting 1, mixed media, guy smiling, looking over to the right, bold red background against rather more neutral colours of watercolor washes, brush drawing, but with blue ballpoint pen, adding some definition and refinement to the line. Portrait 2, we've got a woman holding both hands up to the sides of her face with a look of surprise. So very much, yeah, this one's much closer to a drawing, really. Monochrome treatment, or pretty close to it. Round brush, watercolor, drawing straight in with the brush, and then using that oval round to create the wonderful hair, and just approximating all the tangles in a few brush strokes. And then Portrait 3, coming in by blocking in shapes with a flat brush. Just going for the big shapes initially, minimizing the amount of drawing, and then still with the flat brush, adding a little more pop to the shadows, a few detailed lines, and then just leaving it before overworking the portrait. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope to see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.